Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're continuing The Raging Quiet by Sherryl Jordan. If you missed the last 2 weeks of reading, those will be linked down below. This is our last week of reading this book, and next week we'll be back with a brand new book. So let's jump right into chapter 5. It was sunset when Marnie heard the rumble of wagon wheels. She was still down on the beach, her torn shift in her hands. Quickly, she gathered up the other garments and her shoes and hurried back to the house. She put the things away, combed her tangled hair with her fingers, and stood in the doorway to watch the wagon approach. It was piled high with straw, and a ladder was tied across the top of it. As the wagon came nearer, she heard Isake singing, his voice loud and unrestrained, and her heart sank. He stopped alongside her and raised his hat, a wicked gleam in his laughing dark eyes. "A beauteous maid, if ever I saw one," he said cheerfully. "May I enter your lovely castle there, and partake of partridge eggs and roasted lamb with you?" In spite of herself, she smiled. "You may," she said, "only it will be fish instead, if that is what you've brought." Isaac's merriment dissolved into a puzzled frown, and he scratched his beard. "I think I might have forgot something," he muttered. Marnie shook her head and went back inside. The water was boiling in the pot, and smelled of the onions and cabbage they had brought. She placed the frying pan across the flames and selected a few eggs to fry. Although it was not her fault they had no supplies, she felt mortified at the offering, knowing that at the manor house his meals were banquets. Later, they sat opposite one another to eat at the little table. Isake sat next to the fire. Though a candle burned on the table between him and Marnie, he seemed dark against the flame light, powerful and oppressive. She thought of the first time they had danced together, that golden harvest eve, and how she had liked his cavalier manner and merry eyes, and been enchanted by his voice. He had seemed lordly, enigmatic, and alluring, unlike the uncouth boys who pursued her on the farm. Where had it gone, the laughter and the charm? "You're quiet, my lovely," said Isake, belching. He had bought a small wooden barrel of ale in the village, and he poured himself a pewter tankard full and drank thirstily. In the silence, Marnie could hear him swallowing, and the smack of his tongue as he licked the ale froth from his lips. Even his breathing seemed loud in that alien quiet. Marnie would have given half her life to hear her brothers and sisters again, arguing about who broke the sparrow eggs the littlest brother had found, or whose turn it was to collect firewood. But there was only the crackling of the flames on the dry driftwood, the sounds of the man eating, and the awful lack of words. "I suppose I can forgive your uncanny quiet," Isake said, pushing his empty plate away, "since clever conversation wasn't in the bargain that we made. Still, I was looking forward to some friendly talk after a day in Torcurra. I've never met such a tight-lipped lot. By the way, where did you get the eggs?" "The eggs are from the priest," she said, still not looking at him. "He sent them." "Did he now? I thought you must have stole them from the gulls. How did he send them? By carrier pigeon, or did St. Patrick drop them in? It wasn't any of those paragons of Christian charity from the village, I'll bet." "A boy brought them," she replied. "I passed no one going back to Torcurra on my way home." "It was earlier today." She put down her spoon, though her plate was still half full. "I'll have that if you don't want it," said Isake, and she nodded. He pulled her plate over to him and began eating. He had stretched out his legs under the table, and she could feel his feet pressed against hers, though she drew back to avoid them. Presently, Isake asked, "What sort of boy? A child?" "No. Old as me, perhaps." "Oh, that's fearful old," joked Isake. Seeing that she did not respond, he asked, "Do you intend always to sit with your head bent like that, to rob me of the pleasure of seeing your face?" "No, sir," she replied, bending it lower still. To her surprise, Isake chuckled. "Well, while you're in that lowly state," he said, "you may as well start your prayers. That way we'll get them over early, and I won't fall asleep before you finish them and come to bed." Though her head was low, Isake could see the flush rising from her neck. Amused, he chewed the last mouthful of her meal, then poured himself another tankard full of ale. After a few moments, Marnie got up and began collecting their plates and spoons to take them outside, to wash in the stream. But as she reached for Isaac's spoon, he gripped her wrist, pulled her over to him, and drew her down onto his knee. "Drink this, my lovely," he said, giving her the tankard. "It will loosen you up a little. Lord knows you need it." Taking the drink in both hands, she sipped its bitterness. "That's better," he smiled, his left arm about her waist, his right hand making slow and sensuous circles on her thigh. Marnie placed the tankard back on the table and tried to stand. Isaac held her, shifting his hand from her thigh, moving it up her body to her throat. She turned her face away, but his hand stayed on her, caressing her neck, his thumb moving across her jaw and over her chin and lips. "You're different from my first wife," he said hoarsely. "So small, so smooth, and lovely to behold. How old do you be, Marnie?" 16 summers, sir." He gave a quiet laugh, his hand still fondling her face. "Younger than my last daughter," he said. Very slightly, she shivered, her body rigid. Isaac held her tight, pressing his mouth into the curve of her neck, his right hand roving, urgent and hurting. "Say your prayers quickly while you sit here," he said softly, "and pardon me if I start loving before you've said amen." "Please don't, sir," she whispered. His hand became still, and he half laughed, then swore. "My Christ, you mean it," he said. "You've changed your tune from what you sang before. Where's your fetching smile? You used to be a tempting wench." "I was not, sir." "Ah, yes, you were. Drove me half mad, you did, with your bewitching ways and teasing eyes. Right from that harvest eve when we danced, you led me on with your blushing smiles and your taunting lips. And why call me sir? You're my wife. This is no time to be playing the chaste maid. Half the men on the farm had you. Why so unwilling with me?" "They did not." She jumped up, red with rage, and confronted him. "That's a lie. No one had me." "Not even Jaunty, the plowman's son?" "No, no one, ever. Not until you, last night." "You must hold that memory sweet, then, in your pretty head." "No." "What, not pretty?" "No, not sweet, sir." He went crimson, then his eyes turned hard and angry in the fire's light. "That is a hellish insult to throw in your husband's face, woman," he said. "I'm sorry." "Aye, so am I. Your mother made a grave mistake giving you to me. She should have put you in a nunnery." "It wasn't her mistake, sir. You asked for me." "And you agreed. We made a bargain, my lovely, and you have to keep it, else I shall be obliged to break my side as well, and take away that fine house from your poor family. Think on that, while I go for a walk, and when I come back, I want your prayers done, and you waiting in that bed, and willing, like a true woman and a wife. Then we'll see what we can do to sweeten those sour memories of yours." He strode out, banging the door behind him. She listened until the sound of his boots died away. Then, very slowly, she picked up the plates and spoons and stacked them for washing in the stream in the morning. She piled more wood on the fire and tidied the room. Then, with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face, she went over to the bed and began to undress. The sun shimmered on the brink of the sea, warming the face of the young woman sitting hunched on the shore with a blanket around her. For hours she had sat there, staring at the ocean, seeing nothing. At last she stirred and noticed that a new day had begun. Bending her head on her knees, she tried to pray, but the age-old precepts of her faith were scattered, lost in the chaos of her ruined world, and she could not call them back. She wept, grief-stricken, bereft. Beside her, the sands shifted under approaching feet, and she froze. The footsteps stopped nearby, and she held her breath, but no one touched her or spoke, and after a time she ventured a glance. The mad youth was crouching there. He was so close she could have reached out and touched him, yet he seemed unaware of her. He was facing the sea, his hands clasped loosely between his knees, his face serene and beautiful, and his violet-gray eyes, vivid in that incredible dawn, were full of rapture and light. It was as if he had flown, spirit powerful, to his own world, far from this one and unutterably finer. "What is your name?" she asked. The youth ignored her, lowering his eyelids against the sun. She repeated her question. Again he ignored her, so she touched his arm, and he turned his head and looked at her, suddenly back from his own world, his eyes wary, half afraid. But he saw no anger in her, only the stains of tears and an awful despair. His face changed, and a look of profound sorrow and compassion came over him. Very slowly he lifted his hand and wiped the tears from her cheeks. No other man could have touched her that morning, but the mad youth, with his extraordinary tenderness, gave such a depth of consolation that she found herself leaning her cheek against his hand and sobbing. He wept with her, and there wove between them an understanding, a unity deep and poignant and powerful. Then, suddenly, he got up and ran away. He went up the grassy slope to the right of the cottage, his footsteps long and loping between the wagon tracks. Marnie watched him until he vanished over the brink of the hill, turning right toward the village. Strengthened, she bent her head and prayed. "Merciful Lord, who understands all things," she said, "please forgive my sin because of that man in the house. I vowed to love and cherish him. I vowed it in a holy rite, and I can't do it. Please forgive me. And if it's at all possible, let me get sick, or ugly, or fall ill of the plague so he won't want me anymore. Please do something to stop him wanting me." Behind her, the cottage door banged, and she glanced around and saw Isake coming out. He was partly dressed with a loose-sleeved shirt, brown leggings, and old buckskin shoes. He went down to the stream and washed, and Marnie heard him singing a bawdy ballad he must have learned in an alehouse somewhere. The sands crunched behind her as he came down to the beach, and she pulled the blanket more tightly about her body. Out of the corner of her eye she saw him crouched down in the same place where the mad boy had been. She resented Isaac's being there. "Fancy a swim in the sea, my lovely?" he asked. No. She had been in the sea last night, washing herself, washing and washing and washing, and never feeling clean. "A pity. I had a hankering to see a mermaid," he said, chuckling. "But no matter, we have work to get on with. I have to buy some peat from the farms, since there's little firewood about, but first I'll thatch the roof. The priest loaned me the ladder for it. He's the only one in the village who talked to me yesterday, apart from the innkeeper's daughter and an old drunk in the tavern. Seems we'll be shunned until the friendly folk get used to us. Still, we have each other for company, eh, my lovely?" She said nothing, and Isake laughed and stood up. He put his hand on her shoulder, patting it the way her father used to comfort her when a toy she loved was broken. "I know you're a trifle upset right now," Isake said, "but you'll get to like it, you know. Women do, in the end. When you're finished sulking, come home and get dressed. There's a market day at the village today, they told me. You can go and buy what we need while I'm fixing the thatch. The walk will do you good. You need exercise. That's half your trouble. You think too much." He went back up to the cottage. Soon afterward, she heard him whistling cheerfully while he worked. A while later, she returned to the house. Isake was up the ladder, thatching, binding the loose straw into tight sheaves, which he lay side by side across the wooden rafters and battens, compressing them close with a special clamp, while he prepared the next bundle. The thatch was thick and dense and would last for 30 years or more when it was done. Laying it was skilled work, and Marnie saw that he did it well, though she wished he would not lean so carelessly from the ladder. "I can help you with that, if you like," she called up. "My father taught me to bind the wheat for thatching the manor barn." He grinned down at her, his face florid in the sun. "What I'd like," he said, "is for you to tidy up that mess in our house, and then go to the village and get us some fish, and make us a decent meal. I have a mighty hunger." Guilty at having to be reminded of her duties, Marnie went into the cottage. The door had been left wide open, and already the damp floor steamed in the sun's heat. Isaac's toolbox was open, and she saw that inside everything was neat and tidy, each tool fixed in its place by a leather strap. Last night's plates and spoons remained on the table, and nearby was the barrel of ale and the half-emptied tankard. Flies buzzed over them. Moving to the end of the cottage where the thatch was whole, and Isaac could not see her, Marnie scrambled hurriedly into her clothes. Then she collected the plates and spoons and took them down to the stream to wash. The water gurgled peacefully over the sunny stones, and dragonflies hovered over the surface. Marnie recalled washing dishes in her other home, in a bowl of warm water on the table, and with the younger ones arguing about who would dry them and put them away. She used to resent their shrill voices and constant bickering. Now she yearned to hear them again. Finishing the washing, she went back to the cottage and put the plates and spoons in the little alcove in the wall beside the fireplace. While there, she noticed strange circles and signs scratched into the chimney stones, magical charms to prevent witches flying in through the chimney. Marnie ran her fingertips over them, wondering whose hand had etched them there. She tidied the rest of the room and swept the hearth with the straw broom her favorite brother, Naffy, had made her for a wedding gift. As he had given it to her, he had joked, his eyes sparkling. "You can use it, sis, to sweep that grand husband of yours into bed." "Hush your mouth," she had cried, red-faced and laughing. "You ought not to know of such things." She thought of her brother's playful teasing as she straightened the crumpled bed now, and wept. Finishing her work, she wiped her face on her hands and went outside. Shading her eyes from the sun, she called up to the man on the roof. "I'll go now, if you give me some money." He came down the ladder and went into the house. Going over to his locked chest, he removed a velvet purse, took out a few coins, locked the purse away again, and put the key in the little bag around his neck. "Buy yourself a gift, too, if you want," he said, carefree and generous, as he placed the money in her palm. "A red ribbon, perhaps, for your black hair. That would please me. I gave you some once, but never saw you wear them." "I gave them to the children," she said. "I thought they were for them." Tilting her chin with his forefinger, he looked closely at her face. "Have you been crying again?" he asked. She pulled away from him, and he swore. "You're going to have to make a bigger effort to be happy, Marnie," he said, "else you'll cause us both misery and drive me to drink. Lord knows I'm doing my best, but my patience has its limitations. Now, before you go, I have a thing to ask. Yesterday, when you were cleaning the house, did you find anything?" "Only a lot of dirt and a little spoon. It was broken and rotting." "I meant something of value, woman." "I found nothing else, sir. Did you lose something? If you tell me what it is, sir, I can look for it." "For Christ's sake, stop calling me sir. Call me Isaac." "Yes, sir." Isaac sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "If you ever find anything, you must give it to me. Don't ever try to deceive me. I won't tolerate lies or disobedience or being crossed." "I wouldn't do those things, sir. I'm your wife." "Aye, so you are. I thought you forgot that blissful circumstance last night. Now, go and buy those things for us, and don't be all day about it. I'm starving. You're supposed to be looking after me. That part of our bargain you ought to be willing to keep." Marnie put on her old shoes and placed the coins in the felt purse tied to her girdle. The day was warm, and she put on her white linen hood before picking up the basket that had contained the broken pottery. As she left, Isaac was pouring himself his fourth ale of the day. He drank it in a few thirsty mouthfuls, then climbed up the ladder to continue the thatching on the steep and broken roof. Chapter 6. Rough trestle tables had been set up on the stretch of flat land beside the church, and the people of Torcurra had put out their simple wares. Other craft folk had come from nearby villages as well, and there was a festive air about the place, with a great deal of joking and laughter. Visiting youths were busy eyeing up the Torcurra girls, and a few kisses had been stolen behind the church, among the high stone crosses in the graveyard, until the priest came out to work in his garden nearby. A group of gypsies had arrived, and their colorful caravans with rows of trinkets and bright toys were attracting the children with a copper coin to spend. Marnie stood in front of the potter's stall and selected 2 small glazed bowls and a cup for herself. The potter's wife, a busty woman with rosy cheeks and several chins, was sitting behind the stall, busily sewing when not taking money. Over the flashing needle she inspected the young stranger. Never one to miss a point to gossip about, the woman noted the newcomer's swollen eyelids and the bruises on her wrists as she turned the pottery over. "You'll be the wife of the stranger who came yesterday," the potter's wife said, never interrupting her stitching, her shrewd eyes flicking over Marnie's work-calloused hands and faded clothes. "The handsome man with the fine tunic and deerskin boots." Marnie nodded and indicated the pieces of pottery in front of her. "I'll have these, please," she said, opening her purse. "They say he's from the manor house at Fernley Village," the potter's wife remarked, taking the coin and delving in her money bag for change. But she did not give the money to Marnie straight away. Marnie placed the pottery into her basket and held out her hand for the change. "They say he's a lord," repeated the potter's wife stubbornly. "Do they?" said Marnie. "Aye, though they say his family's lands aren't near as great as they once were. Still, a lord's a lord, whether he be in charge of a great castle or a smaller estate. But you don't have the look of a lady, if you'll pardon my saying so. Those are working hands you have, and he's old enough to be your father. 'Tis curious that you've come here to live, so far from your own kin." Her eyes wandered suspiciously down to Marnie's waist, searching for telltale signs. Disappointed, but still sure of her assessment of the situation, she went on. "Still, 'tis quiet here, and there'll be no talk, and old Biddy can help you when your time arrives. She's cunning when the babes are hard to come by, when the father's a big man like your lord and the wife's so small." "I won't need your Biddy," said Marnie angrily, "and there's no cause for your tongue to wag." The woman's plump cheeks went scarlet, but her voice was cool as she said, "At least he's doing right by you, is your handsome lord, even if he has got an eye for the innkeeper's daughter." Triumphantly, she dropped the coins into Marnie's outstretched palm, then sat down and picked up her sewing again. Shivering in spite of the heat, Marnie went on to the fish booth. It was crowded and noisy, but the voices dropped as she approached. She felt curious stares and heard whispered comments. It took all her will not to run. Calmly, she selected a fish for that night, plus several smoked fillets for the next few days. As she held out a coin to the man behind the booth, a youth leaned on the trestles next to her, grinning into her face. "I didn't think they bred them this pretty in Torcurra," he said, winking at her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marnie ignored him, but the fish seller said, "Watch your tongue, lad. You'll be talking to the wife of a noble lord, in their first days of wedded bliss. Now get away before her husband comes and kicks you all the way back to your own village." People around them laughed, and the youth retreated in search of a more likely prize. Close behind Marnie, an old woman said, her quavering voice barely above a whisper, "I hear they're living in the old cottage in the cove." "Aye," muttered someone else. "They must be in sore need of a solitary life to occupy that house." There were other mutterings, but Marnie did not stop to hear them. Quickly she bought vegetables and bread and escaped. She was almost running as she passed the village well and the church, and did not hear when someone called out to her. He shouted again, and she stopped. It was the priest, hoeing the weeds in the garden outside his house. The garden had a low wall around it to keep out the coarse grass and the tough little yellow flowers that grew along the coast. Seaweed was spread on the wall to dry, for use as fertilizer later on. The priest waved to her, then wiped his forehead on his sleeve. The long habit was coarse wool, and he looked unbearably hot. But he smiled as Marnie approached and propped his hoe against the wall of his house. "Welcome to Torcurra," he said. "Though from the haste you're in, I think perhaps the welcome wasn't very warm." "It wasn't, Father. Thank you for the eggs you sent yesterday. I forgot to bring the basket back, with the little cross you gave. The basket I can wait for, and the cross I'll not be needing. I have enough crosses to last me all my life, and beyond it." He smiled, waving his hand toward the graveyard. Then he noticed the pallor of her skin and the dark shadows under her eyes. "Would you like to come in for a cup of cider?" he asked. "I'm needing one. It's hot work, this gardening. I swear that every year the weeds get stronger and more determined to stay where the Almighty put them." Marnie smiled a little. I'd be grateful for a drink, she said, but I'll wait here, Father. The priest gave her a searching look, then stepped over the little stone wall that edged his garden, and strode down the dirt path to his doorway. Bending his head under the low lintel, he disappeared into the dimness inside. Marnie put her basket on the grass beside the wall and removed her hood, using the wide ties to wipe the sweat from her forehead and neck. It was cool in the shade and quiet after the noise of the market. She could not see the stalls from here and was blessedly free from prying eyes. Beyond the priest's house stood the little stone church. Square and plain, it was saved from austerity by a quaint timbered porch with rustic hand-hewn rafters and tiny leaded windows. A low gate closed it off from the graveyard, where tombstones and carved crosses leaned crookedly in the long grass, shaded by the only trees in the village. Some of the graves were very old, their stone pitted by the salt sea air and stained with moss. To her surprise, she noticed the mad youth lying on the grass among them, his arm across his face. He seemed to be sleeping. The priest came out again, 2 cups of cider in his hands, and he gave one to her. "Did you find all you wanted at the market?" he asked, sitting on the low wall. "Almost," she replied, thinking how like her father he was in his gentle manner and easy way of talking. Short and solidly built, he was more muscular than stout, though he looked as if he enjoyed his food and good wine occasionally. He was 40 summers old, yet appeared younger. His hair was rich reddish brown, receding from his temples and peppered with gray above his ears. He was clean-shaven, with an honest, candid face, and his lively eyes were vivid blue. "What couldn't you find?" he asked. "Maybe I can get it for you." Nothing important, thank you, Father." "Are you sure?" "Yes, it was just a ribbon." "The gypsies always have those." "It's no matter." For a while the priest regarded her, his gaze wise and compassionate, and she had the uncanny feeling that her soul was being read. Blushing, she bent her head and sipped the cider. "They're a strange lot, the people here," the priest remarked presently. "They're close-knit, and not exactly overflowing with the milk of human kindness. Most of them have lived in this place for generations, and they know one another's fathers and their fathers before them. They feel threatened by newcomers, especially people they know nothing about. They were even suspicious of me when I first came here 20 summers ago." He gave a boyish grin, adding, "The old ones still call me the new priest." Marnie smiled at him over her cup. "They'll get used to you," he went on, "but it may take them a while." "How long a while?" she asked, finishing her drink. "If it were 20 summers for you, it will be 50 for me." "Oh, not so long as that," he said, laughing. 45 at most." Marnie laughed too then and gave him back the cup. "Thank you, Father. I was needing that." "How is your husband?" "He's well. He's mending the thatch." Watching her, the priest noticed how the laughter died in her eyes, and something like despair came over her. "How long have you been married, child?" he asked. 2 days, she replied. For a while, silence hung heavy in the sunlit garden. Then the priest said, very gently, "All great changes in our lives are hard to abide. Sometimes, at first, they seem almost unbearable, overwhelming, and we think we shall never find contentment in them. But all things work together for our good, and God always has our happiness in mind." Marnie looked away, biting her lip, and tears ran down her cheeks. The priest wiped his sleeve across his face again, and waited for her to compose herself. They were interrupted by the mad youth. He came from the graveyard, leaping over the far wall into the garden, not noticing that he crushed young cabbages. Seeing his work ruined, the priest jumped up and waved his arms at him. "Mind your feet, Raver!" he shouted, pointing at the little plants. Startled, the youth looked down, noticed the trampled plants, and trod more carefully. He stepped over the wall and touched Marnie's arm, making strange noises in his throat. Suddenly, he crouched down, forming a beak in front of his face with his hands, then flapping his elbows like wings, bobbing his head up and down, and wagging his backside. It was a fair imitation of a chicken laying an egg, and Marnie giggled through her sobs, wiping her eyes with her hands. The priest chuckled too and said, "I know who she is, Raver, and she says she got the eggs. You did well, and I'm pleased." "Is that your name?" Marnie asked the youth. "Raver?" He doesn't talk, said the priest. He just makes sounds, and sometimes, if he's angry or upset, he raves. That's why they call him Raver. Where does he live? Nowhere and everywhere. He's an outcast, survives as best he can. He has no home, no family. As a babe, he was left on the doorstep of one of the houses, brought here, no doubt, by some poor mother from another village, unwed and unable to look after him. One of the women took him in, but couldn't keep him long. He was devilish wicked when he was little, still is sometimes, and impossible to live with. Without warning, a kind of rage gets into him, and he goes like a wild beast. Pray you never see it, for it's a fearful thing. Mostly he's passable, though he hasn't got a mind such as you and I have. Who looks after him now? She asked. I do my best to show him charity. I feed him when he's around and try to encourage the villagers to do the same. But they'd sooner whip him, though they don't dare if I'm about. That's why he's always out in the fields, away from people. Does he really have devils, Father? It seems that way, when he's gripped in his madness. Other times, I think it's the Spirit of Christ himself shines out of him. Where does he sleep? I don't know. The village folk say he sleeps in a tomb. I've tried to get him to stay in my house, but he won't. He's wild, unknowing, like an animal. Heedless of the discussion, the youth picked up the cups from the place on the wall where the priest had placed them. Throwing back his head, he tipped the last drops of cider into his open mouth. His throat was long and live, and his dark hair curled in its damp hollows. I'll get you a drink in a moment, Raver, said the priest. The youth ignored him, licking the rim of a cup with his tongue. All the time he grinned at Marnie, his amazing gray eyes sparkling in the sun. She smiled, 2 points of color in her cheeks, and busied herself putting on her hood. I have some tools your husband can borrow if he needs to repair the house, the priest offered. Thank you, but he has tools. He is skilled at the carpenter's craft. He's using your ladder, though, that you loaned him. Picking up her basket, she turned to go, but hesitated. Father, she said, looking at him straight, what is wrong with the house in the cove? Folks have been talking, have they? He said angrily. I'll bang their stupid skulls together. What's wrong with it? Nothing, child. Something is. Is there a curse on it? I don't think it's a curse so much as the woman who last lived in it. My husband's grandmother? Is that his connection with it? He inherited the cottage when his father died. He said his grandmother owned it, but it hasn't been lived in since. And when I spoke a blessing before we went in, he laughed and said it would need more than a blessing to undo the thing that she put on it. So, you put a blessing on it, did you? That was wise. The woman who lived there, she was a king's mistress, they say. The king visited her there, in that cottage, so the story goes. And after the village folk used to hear her singing at night, when the moon was full, calling her paramour back to her. And if he didn't come, then she went to him, flying on her broom, so they said. She was a witch? That was what they called her. Whether she was or not is for Christ to judge. Did they burn her? I'm afraid so. No one has been near that house since. Not in the 20 years I've lived in the village, anyway. Don't look so upset, child. I'm sure since you've put a blessing on it, it's fine. There's a power for good and a power for evil, and I know the good is greater. Are you sure, Father? I've staked my life on it. Now, go home to your husband and don't think on it any more. By the way, what is your husband's name? I asked him yesterday as he was going, but missed it when he called it out. For a moment, she hesitated. Isake, Father. Isake Isherwood. And yours? Marnie. I'm Father Brannan. Goodbye, Father Brannan. God go with you, Marnie. She went on down the dusty track beside the church, turning around once. Father Brannan was bent over with his hoe again, and Raver had vanished. Behind them, people swarmed about the market stalls, and the gypsies were dancing while a man played a fiddle. The sea wind carried the music to her, and Marnie stepped in time to it across the sunny grass, her basket swinging in her hand. It was half an hour's walk back to the cottage in the cove, and Marnie enjoyed it. The day was shining, and tiny insects rose, glittering out of the grasses as she walked by. As she reached the top of the hill, she saw the cove, curving and blue as cornflowers under the sun. Her cottage was milk white in the shadows under the trees, and its strip of new thatch was golden beside the old roof's darker gray. It was not yet finished. She could not see Isaac and thought he must be inside getting a drink, since the day was hot. Another ale, no doubt. But her footsteps dragged as she neared the house, and a kind of dread fell over her. It was quiet, too quiet. The door was half closed and the cottage dim inside. As she approached, she called out, "Sir? Isaac? Is all well?" There was no reply. She pushed open the door. Creaking, it swung back against the wall, making such a crash against the stones that she jumped and cried out. She cautiously went in and saw Isaac lying on his back on the thatch-strewn floor, his head against the hearth, his eyes open and staring, and the stones beneath him running black with blood. High above him, a broken rafter slanted downward, sharp and jagged from the roof. Marnie dropped her basket and sank to her knees beside him. "Isaac?" she whispered. A blowfly walked across his pallid lips, and she reached out to brush it away. His lips were stiff, yellow as wax, and cold. No breath came from them, and his eyes were dull and blind with a strange pale blueness overlying the black. Getting up, she backed slowly away, then staggered outside and vomited into the grass. Then, sobbing and screaming, she ran back to the village. All right, I know that's a bit of an awkward place to leave it, but we're out of time, both for today and for the month. So if you'd like to read this book, our library actually does not own this book. This is my copy, but we can get it for you through interlibrary loan by checking for other libraries in the state that have it. If you don't know about interlibrary loan, or ILL for short, it's a free service where we can borrow books from other libraries for our patrons. All right, thanks for joining me for this story this month, and have a great weekend. See you again next time. Bye.